Hello, American Government and Politics class. I wanted to take this opportunity to revisit and kind of bring together some of the concepts that we've been working through recently around this middle of the semester time. So I want to walk through a couple of things about two of the branches of government we've studied, the president or the executive branch, and Congress, the legislative branch. And then we will be seeing a lot more of the courts that we've already covered as well in this in our week on civil liberties and civil rights as well. I know that we have started thinking about our paper topics at this time of the semester, and one of the options is you can choose to do a case study on um, on one aspect of separation of powers, such as the veto or et cetera, or how Congress and the president work together on foreign relations or et cetera. So that's another reason I want to bring together a few concepts for us from our textbook. So just revisiting the president and the executive branch a little bit more. Of course, we want to be able to describe, according to the Constitution, what are the powers of the president. And we looked into this in our past week's assignments. Uh, if you remember, the executive branch implements or executes or carries out the laws. Um, and whereas the legislative branch makes the laws. And something that should be coming up soon here is the State of the Union address. And hopefully you noted that it is actually a requirement in the Constitution that the president address the country at least once a year. They address Congress, actually. They didn't know about TV when they wrote it, obviously, but um, that's what the State of the Union is. He or she actually has to do that. Um, Another just point I want to remind us about is the president can, and we looked at this in past weeks, they can appoint heads of all their departments and some of the agencies and components within each of those departments. Those are political appointments too, and these have to be approved by Congress as well as judicial appointments, as you may remember. Um, Important here, the president has the power to be the commander-in-chief of the military, but cannot unilaterally, meaning all by themselves, declare war. The executive branch can't do that without Congress agreeing to it, but they can engage in informal activities that don't amount to a declaration of war. As we know, the U.S. hasn't declared war since, I believe, World War II. Also, the president and Congress both have roles in international relations. The president can make treaties with other nations, but Congress has important roles in that as well. Okay. We looked at how presidential power has expanded a bit over time, sometimes for good reasons. For example, we looked at the New Deal and President FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he was just trying to cope with first the Great Depression, and then the U.S. was faced with the setup for World War II, and so while he did get a lot of other opinions than his own, he also ended up expanding presidential power quite a lot because he was just trying to get stuff done. That's an oversimplification, but um, and he's not the only one. There are other presidents who have expanded presidential power over time. And sometimes, like I say, it was for a good cause, and other times it was kind of for a different reason. And but it has just kind of turned out that way. So you want to remember what the vesting clause is. As you hopefully know, Article 2 is what talks about the powers of the president and the executive branch. And the vesting clause allows for what are called inherent powers, meaning you can infer that something is within the president's authority, even if the Constitution doesn't literally say the president may do this specific thing. That said, that doesn't mean the president is above the law. And I want to get into that when we talk about the president's unilateral actions. So again, the president's unilateral actions are things he or she can do with no approval from anyone else, whereas there are many things the president requires approval from others to do, other branches of government and other parts of government. We know the president can veto, and they're not usually overridden, but we also should know that there's a lot of negotiation that takes place about passing laws. So Congress has the power to pass a law, and the president does not. But the president is an agenda setter, and one example of that is the State of the Union address. There are others, for example, working with the president's party in Congress, and we're going to talk about this, but sometimes the president and uh, the majority in Congress are the same party, and other times they are not. So it kind of also determines how much of the president's agenda they can get done. Now, in this administration, we see a lot of things being done through executive orders, and that is absolutely a power of the president. A president can do executive orders all by themselves. They don't need approval. That said, in the order of, what law is more powerful than what policy, a law passed by Congress is the most. So a president can't make an executive order that directly contradicts a law passed by Congress. If he or she does that, it ends up getting tested by the courts, which is another really interesting example of separation of powers and checks and balances. And sometimes the courts might say, well, yes, the president can do that, what they did. And other times the courts might say, no, this directly conflicts with, what laws Congress passed. And so, for example, with the executive branch, as we look at restructuring it or kind of reshaping it or reducing its force, etc., in terms of the bureaucracy that we also read about, the president has some power to do that for sure, but it must align with the budget that Congress passed for the executive branch. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit here. Um, these are some of the other unilateral actions a president can do. Example of a proclamation, February is Black History Month, and a president, almost every year, they typically declare it is Black History Month. All right. So the executive branch, you all probably know it's not just the president. He or she has their staff in the executive office of the president, but the vast majority of the executive branch is all these departments of the government, the cabinet and the bureaucracy. And I don't know if I've mentioned to you all before in detail, but I was a what you call a bureaucrat for some years of my career. And so I've worked in the federal government in a few different areas for a long time. And so a bureaucrat's it has a connotation, right? It doesn't make us sound like we were the most efficient people, um, but I can tell you a little bit more about what it was like to work in the bureaucracy, quote unquote, in a bit here. These are the seals, though, on your screen of all the departments under the executive branch that make up the cabinet. There are also independent commissions and agencies. One that we've heard a lot about lately is the Federal Communications Commission, for example. That's supposed to be independent. It's not under one of the president's political appointees, although he does appoint the head of that one too. So that makes it a little tricky, but it's not under the departments. I worked for the Department of the Interior and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security during my career. Um, we talked a little bit about how the president must work with Congress, right? And so typically, historically, the president can get the most done in their first year. It's like the honeymoon period. Congress, for whatever reason, it's easier to get stuff done with them during the beginning of their term. And then, so we elect representatives to the House of Representatives every 2 years, right? And so those are the midterm elections. So we got a new president, uh, and then in 2 years later, we will vote for Congress again. And what usually happens is whatever party the president is not will usually gain a little ground in Congress in the midterm elections, although it depends on approval ratings. And just to go back a minute, I have a little box on approval ratings here. That is, you probably know, and you probably read in your book, but that's when, you ask the general public, um, do you approve of the job the president is doing? And we'll talk about those kind of surveys, I believe, next week. But essentially, it's the percentage of people who say yes, I approve. Um, and so some presidents have lower ones, some have higher ones, and they go up and down during a president's term. They are typically highest at the beginning because no one's mad at that president yet, or they haven't blamed that president for the rising cost of groceries yet, or etc. Um, although in America, perhaps someone is already mad at the president at the beginning, but you get the idea. Um, I use this photo from this old show, The West Wing. I don't know if any of you have ever watched it. A lot has changed since it was made, but it's also pretty relevant in some ways too. So this would be the president's staff, and these are the folks who are like working with Senator so and so and Representative so and so to try to get things done, to negotiate with Congress and interest groups and move forward the president's agenda. But what I like about this TV show, at least, is that you see them trying to do the right thing almost all the time, and that's all any of us can do, right? So anyway, okay. Uh, we touched on this briefly, presence and foreign relations or international relations. Um, Economic policy. So we are seeing examples of that now with the tariff stuff. It's also really important that a US president, helps or leads the United States in participating in these international organizations. America's historically been a key part uh, since the 20th century, a key part of NATO when the United Nations were formed. We're an important part of that historically. And the second half of the 20th century, that was the Cold War, where we were informally and not with overt military action. We were trying to prevent communism from spreading as a country. There are all kinds of priorities in terms of how we relate to other countries that a president has to deal with, and you can see examples of some of them here. But this is why presidents go visit other world leaders, and usually they choose them based on what's important at the time for America, what's important at the time um, for the world, and for that president's agenda. Okay, so the bureaucracy, I just want to touch on this a little bit more. Um, Specialization is a hallmark of bureaucracies, and they often operate in a hierarchy, a chain of command. And both of these things are true in my experience in working for the government. And not all bureaucracies are government, but the federal government is made up of bureaucracy, yes. So specialization is one of the kind of the best things about the federal workforce, in my opinion, because you can really get people who, not on their first day there, but after a little while, they're really an expert on what they do. And so a single bureaucrat. For example, in my earlier career in the government, I really learned the details and nuances of a specific set of policies that had to do with all the international students who come to the US on a student visa. And there are a lot of complicated things and like special cases and questions about those policies. And I became an expert over time on that. And that was my specialization. Um, Now, could I have gone over to the Department of Energy and become an expert on, clean energy or oil or this or that and the other? No, I just had a certain specialization. The government also does merit-based hiring in the vast majority of hiring, and they bring in folks who are an expert in a certain field. So, one of my most recent jobs in the government was in the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and they they really brought in folks from the tech industry because, cybersecurity, you want you want to take what's best about the efficiency of corporations and kind of have that work hand in hand with the longstanding expertise in security that a federal government kind of has, and I thought that was a good thing. Um, so a little bit of editorializing there about the specialization. Um, Also, it is a chain of command that gets less formal sometimes, and everyone's friendly, and it's not exactly fully like, say, being in the military, but you have an organizational structure, supervisors, their supervisor, etc. Um, I would also say that in a bureaucracy and in the federal government, there's sometimes been issues where like one team didn't know what the other team was doing or didn't work well together. But I've seen a lot of great teams too, and people who are, working not just in their little special compartment, but across, different organizations to really collaborate. So you can see both ends, the negatives and positives. One more thing I want to say, though, about the chain of command and the hierarchy and the federal workforce. Uh, One thing that we do that is like the military, whenever anyone is hired to the federal government, you are sworn in. You raise your hand and you promise to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And it's a pretty serious thing. It's a pretty cool thing. And ideally, and in almost all cases, bureaucrats are supposed to stay steady across one president to another. The government is supposed to keep that specialized knowledge and expertise, and have that continuity so that even when agendas change or priorities change, you haven't lost all that knowledge, all those best practices and all the things like that. Hopefully you watched this video a couple weeks ago on the civil service. I guess the point of it is, in part, government does more than you think, like the departments of the executive branch. Although I will also say, to be fair, the federal workforce and the executive branch and the bureaucracy, it does keep growing and growing. And most folks who work there, we feel like we could still use more people. And that is partly because, the landscape of things that need to be done and taken care of in America, from cyber threats to transportation to the environment to agriculture, that keeps changing, expanding. But another part is, sure, there could be places to be more efficient or maybe to streamline, right? So it's both and. This is just an example organizational chart of that hierarchy I was telling you about at the cybersecurity agency where I used to work. Yeah, so this is kind of explaining something that was in your book about the bureaucracy. And ideally, each team member will have their own set of critical tasks and bring them together, and together they're experts and they're building a culture. I will say this has been true for some time across the federal workforce. There is a requirement that every government agency and department has to give a survey every year about how it is to work there to all their employees, right? And things change. Like some have more positive responses over here and more negative over here, and this and that. But one thing that tends to be very consistent is the vast majority of the bureaucracy or federal workers are very mission oriented. They want to be part of an organization that has a purpose and greater than themselves, and that motivates them. So there's that. All right. Um, this this graph was in your chapter on the bureaucracy, and the numbers may have shifted a bit since this time, although it's not very old at all. And so you can see how small the Department of Education is compared to the Department of Defense or of War. If yeah, and the VA is really big because they're providing healthcare across the entire country, etc. So you can see size, number of employees for them. Okay. Um, We are going to come back to this part in our week on participation in the government, but I hope you kind of checked this out in your chapter and read the video. And now just want to shift over to Congress. And again, I know that this is past week's content, but I just wanted to kind of bring it together for you. I wanted you to focus on your midterm, and now we're going to reorient ourselves on continuing to learn the rest of the content in the course, and then do our paper, and then eventually it will be finals time again, exam time again. Um, so some of Congress we've covered through your reading and your assignments and just talking about how they work with the president. So there is a structure to how Congress works, and your book says that sometimes you can get gridlock. What's gridlock is when like people can't agree enough to get something done, and that does happen sometimes. Because of the structure of Congress and like it's not one party or the other, it's just there's going to be a majority and minority at all times, and sometimes when you put all of that together, you get stuck. And that's why, unfortunately, we have government shutdowns, which result in, of course, those bureaucrats that we were talking about, those federal workers not being able to go to work or get paid. And some have to go to work but not get paid if they're in an essential position. For example, even the US military during a shutdown, um, they will have to work, but their paychecks will be on a backlog, which is a bummer, right? Okay. Um, oh, I should add here though, that said, there are times when members of Congress believe that what's going to happen if they don't let the shutdown occur is a worse evil than doing the shutdown. And I think that's why shutdowns happen. But it also sometimes becomes a tool for um, negotiation and fighting. And it doesn't feel so great if you're the government worker who isn't getting paid, that you're a tool in this game. You know what I mean? But I do believe there are noble motivations at work as well. Okay. So just remember that word bicameral, two houses. Congress has two houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives. And remember when we talked about, how all the plans and the compromises that resulted in the Constitution. So they compromised on between the big states and the small states, right? So that's why each of 50 states has two senators, um, and each uh, state has representation by their population in the House, but it's limited to 435 members. Also, some U.S. territories, such as the District of Columbia, they have a non-voting member of Congress of the House. And that is why some of the territories um, consider wanting to be a state because, you know, this way back from America's founding, no taxation without representation, right? Well, if your member cannot vote, are you represented? But then some of them also like to have sovereignty over their own, territory with their own specific needs. So those are questions that they can answer for themselves by self-determination, and there's a balancing of those needs there. Anyway, okay, so your member of Congress, usually if someone says like member of Congress, they usually mean your representative. They can be called a few different things, congressperson, congressman, congresswoman, representative, etc. Senators are usually just called senators, but the Senate is part of Congress just as much as the House. Hopefully you read about the powers of Congress. For example, big news right now um, is regarding immigrants or basically anyone that the executive branch is choosing to enforce against in that kind of realm or sphere. And so a good example about one of the powers of Congress is they passed the fundamental law underlying all of our immigration policy some years ago called the Immigration and Naturalization Act, INA. And Then there's a bunch of policies that the executive branch makes more specific through that regulation process where I had you comment for your homework on a regulation. That's where they'll get into those specifics about that underlying law. But those regulations can never override the law. They just provide detail on what that law means on the day to day and for people who are applying for, asylum or citizenship or this or that visa or etc. Um, and don't forget the elastic clause, the necessary and proper clause. Think of it like if you have a big food meal, you need elastic pants, and those pants can stretch. That waistband can stretch if you have a big meal. And it's just a silly example to help you remember that the powers of Congress can expand through this necessary and proper or this elastic clause if they need to make a law in order to do all the other things that it says they should do. Okay. All right. Um, we've talked about impeachment a little as a check and balance and as part of separation of powers. Sometimes the threat of impeachment, kind of like the threat of shutdown, is a tool that folks can use to negotiate between Congress and the president. But it's also supposed to be, it's if somebody is, you know, an appointee or the president or a judge is not doing their job properly, or if they have character or legal issues that make them not an appropriate person to carry out that, really important work, then that's when impeachment could happen. Impeachment does not equal removal, as you probably remember. There has to be a two-thirds majority, which would be hard to do because you'd really have to get people across the two parties to fully agree on getting rid of this person. And there's a good chance that if that person, the party who aligns to the president will probably not agree to that at that given time. All right. America does not have great views of the president, um, but sorry, of Congress. America does not have great views of Congress, unfortunately. But I like as a whole, but we like our individual representatives and senators, generally speaking. So that's what this chart shows. So there was only 13% approval of Congress overall in 2024, excuse me. But it looks like on our individual, uh, who we reelected in our own district in our own state, it was once they're in, they have a better chance of staying in, basically. Once we've elected the new person, and that's not just about how we vote and how we think of them, it's also because they are able to raise more funds and more support. They already have a support staff. They are able to communicate and market about the things they've done since they entered office. There are a lot of other reasons too why incumbents, and incumbent means like the person who's already in the office. So it's most congressional or Senate races, unless someone's really old and is just retiring or someone passes, it will be an incumbent against a new person of the opposite party. Okay. Hopefully you watched this fun crash course video the other day. We talked about redistricting versus gerrymandering. And redistricting, it happens every 10 years, right? Based on the US Census, which tells us how many people and who they are in America and where they live, meaning so to keep the congressional districts the right size and equal sized, there can be redistricting. When you manipulate that to get a certain of a district that will vote a certain way, even if the lines you're drawing on the map make no sense at all, that is gerrymandering. Um, we also have, you can have majority minority congressional districts, which are often in urban centers, meaning like in Ohio, for example, generally speaking, Columbus votes more liberal, and then like one or two counties south will definitely overall vote more conservatively. And then, there might be a city in that county that votes more liberally, but as a county as a whole, and then in the district, because there's more rural area in that district, possibly, then that one might have a conservative representative. And then if there's a district that is just in the city, that one probably has more, maybe a Democrat or a liberal representative, etc. This is a picture of Ms. Kimberly T. She's a tribal leader. As you may know, tribes are sovereign, but they also have representation, through their state and localities. Okay. I would just make sure you know this chart, how a bill becomes a law. If you've ever seen that really old Schoolhouse Rock video, I'm just a bill on Capitol Hill. I won't sing to you anymore, don't worry. But this shows you the important role of subcommittees and committees. Um, if you are a newbie in Congress, like you're the young congressperson and you just it's your first term and you just came there, you might or might not get the committee you want, but you're going to try to get on a subcommittee and committee that has to do with issues that your voters, your residents in your district care about. And there are just generally like more prestigious and important committees where the more senior you are in Congress and in your party, the more likely you are to get on or lead that committee. I don't know, Homeland Security, international relations, stuff like that. Oh, defense spending. The committee's not called up, but the committees that address defense spending, those are kind of a hot ticket where the money's at. And so this is another reason why incumbents may be successful in staying in office because if you have that pull on a committee, you could have a higher profile. You could also maybe steer things in such a way, like if it's on agriculture and that's a big deal in your district, perhaps you could promote your voters, the people you're representing. You could promote their agenda on agriculture in that committee, etc. And then just something to remember is two things actually to remember regarding the way the executive branch relates to Congress and these committees, right? So every year, before it's time to pass the budget, every department head and a bunch of agency heads too, they're usually called down to these various committees to justify what they used the money for in the past and why they need money for the following year and what they're doing and what are these critical issues facing America and why do we need money to implement the laws in this area, right? And so that's another thing these committees do. Occasionally, too, those folks can get called into the committee if something is not going well, like um, how could you let this or that happen in your under your area of responsibility, whether it's Homeland Security or any of the other departments. And then the other thing I did want to point out here is the Rules Committee. Um, so they have some power to decide how much this bill that some folks want to make it a law, how much is it going to be debated? If the Rules Committee likes it, maybe they are going to choose what rules will apply. There are some rules that always apply in how Congress works, right? But they can decide like maybe there shouldn't be a lot of debate or like maybe we don't need a lot of debate. We think this is going to pass. Like if it's like let's protect and help our veterans in a non-controversial way, pretty much everyone is going to say yes to that because it would be a bad look not to, among other reasons. Also, the veterans probably deserve it, all of that, right? So then they'll be like, let's not debate this a lot. Or if they're afraid there's going to be a filibuster, like which I'll show you in a minute here, a filibuster, or hopefully you watch the video. They could change the rules somewhat or adjust them to prevent that from happening and get the bill pushed through. Okay, so the conference committee, just remember that means it's when the House and the Senate, certain folks get together in the conference committee in case the Senate and the House disagree on what the final bill should say, like for example, on the budget law that they do every year or ideally do every year, they are going to get together in the conference committee and iron out the differences between what the Senate wants in there and the House wants in there. All right. I put this in just as an example of what the Appropriations Committee, which that's a powerful one, by the way, because appropriations means like we are giving you money, we're making the budget, we're appropriating money. Now, of course, as I just said, like all of Congress has a big role in that, but this is an example of when they're sitting in that committee negotiating on what's going to be in some law. Okay. Um, and you can see a lot more examples on congress.gov. Hopefully you clicked that link the other week. And then you just want to know what a markup session is, which I think is what was going on in this particular video. And that could be when the Joint Committee gets together to work through those differences, for example. Oversight is what I told you, like when they call down representatives and leaders in the executive branch to discuss, well, we're giving you these millions of dollars and yet you still let this bad thing happen or you still didn't accomplish this good thing, and why is that, etc. And then you have committees that could be temporary or for different purposes, and then you have the ones that are always a committee in every Congress. Watch this video if you didn't already from our week on Congress, but it's a cute example of a filibuster for a good cause. There's also a very old black and white movie called Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and he's like this new to Washington guy who wants to like be honest and a good guy and expose issues and injustices and how the government is working, and he does a filibuster in there as well. I think he also goes down to the Lincoln Memorial on the National Mall that we talked about earlier and has like a heart-to-heart in front of the giant Lincoln statue. So anyway, if you ever like classic movies, these are the some titles of the leaders in Congress. Um, you should probably you probably know like what most of these mean, and then just a reminder about what the whip is. They are kind of like a deputy to some of the leaders, majority or minority, and they're called the whip because they're supposed to quote unquote like whip up the votes. So get more people to vote for the thing that their party leadership and their party in Congress is trying to get done. So they might make a deal. They might even make a deal across, and all Congress people can make a deal across party lines. For example, I'll support your this if you'll support my that, or my constituents really want and need this. So, what would it take for me to get that done, etc. All right, we will talk more about interest groups, but I know you've encountered them in our discussions of pluralism, right? And they are one party that can influence legislation. We're also going to find out in our week here on civil liberties and civil rights that they are free to do so through money. It's been determined that campaign finance is a form of free speech, which means they can help a candidate get elected or stay in office, and then they will expect reciprocity. They will expect some support for their agenda. And it's not just, organizations like the NRA or Planned Parenthood or et cetera. It's also, corporations these days, big companies, and they want to protect their financial interests, which can be concerning to us, the average citizen, right? But we'll talk more about that in a bit. But we as constituents, will talk also about all the ways we can influence legislation, and we can reach our representatives and try to ask them to truly represent our interests, even if, not everyone, we don't agree with everyone in our district, or not everyone in our district agrees with us, right? Or our state. Okay. You just want to remember these two terms, and it's kind of a contrast, like some of the other terms we've learned. Trustees or delegates, right? Is our representative our trustee or our delegate? Meaning, have we decided that this person is a good leader, a good person, and we just we trust them to do whatever they think they need to do, whatever's best for us, right? For us and for the nation. Or should it be a more direct form of representation, meaning it's not just about what they think, what kind of person they are. No, it should be more about what kind of people we are, their constituents, and what we want, what we need, and what America needs, as taking our opinions on the matter, right? So these are two models of any kind of leadership, really, but definitely regarding our elected officials. And so think about which one you'd prefer. Um, and so a good thing could be like if there are only two candidates in an election, if one of them really is someone you feel you trust, great, you're in a good place. If you're not sure about either one of them or, you know, the person who wins, you would prefer they listen to your view, even if you weren't the one who you're in the minority, then you may want another model, right? So yeah. Okay. The United Kingdom is a parliamentary system, so they don't directly vote for their prime minister. Um, and so that is different. Some countries have a prime minister and a president. Um, we just have the president, no prime minister, because we're not a parliamentary system. But if we were, then the probably the majority leader in Congress would probably be our prime minister. Okay. And then why do I have bacon here? It used to be called pork. Now it's called earmarks or community project funding or congressionally directed spending. That is where there is I don't know, a bill, a law that's going to pass on environmental regulations, loosening them, tightening them, doesn't matter. And somewhere in there, Representative so and so from the 12th district in such and such state, they throw in a little detail about, and by the way, we're going to build a new park in this town over here just because it will get them reelected. Or they might have a good motive where the folks who live there really want that park and that's why they're doing it. But either way, the general idea is throwing something that's not completely relevant into a law and getting folks to agree with it in return for your vote for that law. And that thing that you put in there just serves your district and it's pretty specific to usually to the politician continuing to be in politics as well. Okay. Um, just we haven't created our bibliography for our papers yet, but we're going to do that this week. But there are some links in this week on Congress that you'll also find in Blackboard that will help you create a bibliography for your papers. All right, so that's all I really wanted to bring together in this video. We will be talking more about civil liberties and civil rights soon. Thank you.